So I guess I'd just start by saying when I'm sharing screen this way, I can't see you guys. So
Then do it the other way, Molly. I think you want to be able to see us. Yeah, really, it's fine. It was totally
uh,
fine before. Yeah,
but
sorry,
now
folks.
similarly, I think I switched something in the settings. So I think we should go with I don't think I can go back to seeing it at the moment. So
Um,
I
sorry,
think
we
I
scrambled
think I
things a bit
goofed.
for you.
I think I goofed in changing it. But I'll just start. How about that? I want to
The
thank you
screen
guys.
is yours, Molly. Looking forward to hearing your presentation. Take it away. Yay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The best thing, I guess, to let me know that something's amiss, since I can't see, would probably be to just either put it in chat or to verbally just call out, and I can then go, back to you. And I'm happy to take clarifying questions, but I would guess just request that you hold all substantive questions to our lively discussion at the end. I'm excited to talk with you today about this paper. This is a co-authored work with the graduate student Alex here at Penn State, and one of your colleagues at Wisconsin in Population Health, Tiffany Green. But the paper is under review, but it will come back to my desk. So I look forward to your comments and feedback so that I can improve the paper. Before I dive into the paper, though, I just want to give a little bit of background about who I am and what I do. As Mike indicated, I am one of the sociology department's graduates, and my first act prior to tenure, I was primarily investigating questions that thought about how families produce and reproduce inequality across generations. And in that at work, I kind of considered a whole host of different outcomes, whether it was education or welfare use and sometimes health. But since getting tenure in my second act, I've shifted to focusing a lot more on health as the primary dependent variable for much of my analysis. And in that process, I've been thinking about the social determinants of health, still, though, focusing on families as a key site for that production. So in my work, I generally draw from three research areas, and the bulk of it, or a large part of it, thinks about intergenerational patterns and processes of inequality. And here, when I say intergenerational, I think about the transition from parents and their resources to children. And I see the paper that I'm presenting today as part of that body. Other work I do, though, also considers how population change intersects with and potentially contributes to health inequalities. But my definition of population change is rather broad. Sometimes it's in the sort of bucket of demographic factors of my training and position, but I also think about the rise of overweight and obesity and how the shift in the prevalence of that health condition may have also changed the way we respond to it and the experiences of people who present with heavier body weights. I also recently began projects with several interdisciplinary colleagues here at Penn State thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic. Lastly, there's a fun area of my research, I think, that engages with and thinks about gender and families and the intersection of gender in family to think about health, but not just the health of children, but also the health of mothers in particular. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the Marcellus Shale, and there's a lot of good research on the Marcellus Shale for a lot of reasons. I was here in Pennsylvania when the shale development process began, and many of us were like, just curious and excited and some fearful about what changes were underway. And many of us here at Penn State, put an ear to the ground and started paying attention to what was happening. The ecologists were worried about forest fragmentation. Engineers were worried about the gravel roads and the transportation of farm products through the state, since many of our roads are gravel-based. But the social scientists were worried about the potential conflicts and challenges within governments and communities as this new outside industry came in. To be honest, drilling started in Pennsylvania, United States. That's like Penn Oil, if you think about the company. But it had been a while since there had been drilling for oil and gas in Pennsylvania. And so this new industry was both seen as outsiders and threatening. And so with a group of interdisciplinary scholars in the height of the shale era, we went into the field and were in 4 communities. We had extended interviews with key community leaders and residents. We also had some surveys. And it was kind of with that experience, I could build upon and create this project I'm talking about today that thinks about Marcellus Shale, though, in a really different way. for me, and now, I think about Marcellus Shale and the boom it created as a very valuable natural experiment. And the thinking about that comes from the attention to the complexity of the factors that produce health. So here we have a graph or a picture of the social ecological model. And at this, and I hope this is one reason to change the screen is to make sure the slides are visible for you guys. We have individual or population health here at the foreground, and the boxes behind it reflect, if you will, increasing hierarchies of organization that influence health. The first two boxes are inside the body, pathophysiological processes or genetic risk factors and so on. And it's only at the third box we think about individuals and their behaviors, predispositions, patterns, maybe even psychological orientations. But as we can see, is even that is highly influenced by a series of ever increasing institutional factors that influence all of those that are downstream. But a sociological ecological model also notes and emphasizes the role of place and how those are grounded in particular spaces. And it also pays attention to time, and in particular, thinking about life course development, such that experiences and exposures early in our life, and as we move through different social roles, accumulate and influence these layers and processes to affect health. What that then means, though, of course, is that if we go into any community, field, study, or family, at any given point in time, the factors that we're interested in studying are highly correlated with each other and interconnected in important and historical ways. That, from a sociological perspective, is super interesting, and I usually find that enjoyable. But if I put on my interventionist hat or a policy hat, that becomes difficult, because if we want to shift conditions to actually improve the health and well-being of our fellow society members, and particularly the least among us, we need to better know what particularly has the largest effect or significant effects that we can then use as tools to intervene and make improvements. I could fill the building I'm sitting in, the buildings you're sitting in, with prior research that demonstrates that having low income or different forms of material deprivation is associated with poorer health and well-being on a host of different indicators. But the key question is whether that's causal or reflective of this interconnected pattern of other social conditions that matter. So for me, I'm really interested in thinking about whether we can untangle that process, and I'm going to leverage the Marcellus Shale to help do that. In the process, I've created a series of papers that try to think about leveraging the Marcellus Shale as a natural experiment to study the effects of income on a host of indicators, particularly directed for children's health and well-being. And the process of developing a paper thinking about maternal health behaviors and birth outcomes, we as colleagues, we recognize we need to understand if the income changed who is giving birth, and therefore patterns of fertility. So why it may not seem initially obvious that fertility is an indicator of health, but some might argue it is. For the demographers, in many ways, it's an indicator of population health in terms of a structural sense, because it helps determine the growth and the size of the future population. But even from a sort of family sociology perspective, fertility becomes important because it's key in the intergenerational transmission of inequality. That process of gestation and the conditions at birth manifest themselves throughout the life course in the second generation. And so who gives birth becomes an important story about that intergenerational transmission. And so we've taken on fertility as sort of the outcome in the paper topic for today. That was a large lead up. Thank you for indulging me. From here on, this is kind of where I'm headed. I'm going to give you a background and motivation, builds on old theory with new ideas. I'm going to give you more specific information about how we leverage the Marcellus Shale, talk briefly about data and methods, but I'm open to talking more in the Q&A session. And then we'll do a brief review of like the association that we do observe in these settings for fertility and income. And then I'll give you the results from the quasi-experimental or the natural experiment using the Marcellus Shale for an instrument for income. And I'll conclude with a discussion. Okay, so diving in. So many of you are aware, fertility has been on the decline for decades, if not a century. And we can see this is happening globally. So it's within that context that this paper emerges. This y-axis is really, I like it a lot. It's very intuitive. The idea is, on average, how many live births will a woman have in her lifetime? Okay, so we can see back in 1950 across the globe here in black, that on average women had 5 children. In more high income countries, here in purple, the average in 1950 was lower, but at 3. And we've seen the declines globally and in high income countries. The US here is in blue. There's been times we've had more and times we've had fewer, but we're now converging with other high income countries. This dashed line here is indicating what demographers refer to as replacement level fertility. The value of 2.1 is seen as significant because if you will ignore migration, in migration and out migration, if you have a replacement level of fertility, then the population can be stable, and thus we have a significant and continued sort of level of population for the workforce, for the taxpayer base, and so on. And so in many ways, replacement level of fertility is linked to broader macroeconomic health of the society. Now, as we've seen, countries have been shifting their fertility downward, such that many countries are now below this replacement level fertility, also reflected here in the dashed line on the same second graph. The countries with the very lowest low fertility, like Singapore, Japan, Italy, and so forth, are at quite low levels of fertility. And the US here is in the more blue. And in these low fertility countries, they've instituted a series of policies that aim to effectively increase household and family income through either direct transfer or in-kind benefits to offset childbearing costs with the aim of increasing fertility. And this has been somewhat discussed in the United States as a potential policy lever for our context to think about, would that increase fertility here? But it's unclear if those policies would work. So it's also with that in mind that this paper is grounded. There's good reason to think that maybe increasing income would increase fertility, because we often see historically that US fertility does decline when the economy is in recession. And we've seen that across different historical moments. And there's been great work lately with scholars studying the effects of the Great Recession on US fertility. But it remains unclear if in the United States, there's a causal effect of income gains on fertility. And so that's where this paper takes off. If we start from a theoretical perspective, why would we expect income to increase fertility? Now, the standard expectation, the standard theoretical model, comes from microeconomics, often referred to as the new home economics model, usually attributed to Becker, but there's been other scholars, of course, in the area. And the idea is that fertility is part of a rational choice, individual action model of behavior, wherein people have preferences for fertility that have been fixed, and that fertility is just one of many choices that people can make to maximize their family's well-being. And the idea is that people have to make financial considerations and considerations with their time, and have this trade-off in opportunities. But without additional income, these financial constraints constrain fertility and constrain family size. So the argument is made that if you were to hold the amount of time and energy and money that people invest in their children, and that for many sociologists is a difficult word, but how much money, time, and energy they put into rearing and raising their children in the aim of building the children's own human capital, if you hold that fixed, the expectation is that income would increase fertility. Yet, economists do recognize, of course, that there will be variation in fertility, but the source of that variation for them comes from differences in their individual and couple level traits. And the idea is that for each individual or couple, they have their own ledger for considering whether or not to increase fertility, and the characteristics they bring then can change that ledger and calculation. Even early studies, though, recognize that the idea that we hold constant our investment in children doesn't always play out or work. In other words, they've recognized even early on that it's more likely that people who themselves have higher levels of human capital, those who themselves have higher levels of education, are more likely to also strategize and work toward increasing their children's human capital, so that there might be a preference, if you will, for, as they put it in their economics terms, child quality over child quantity. And so the expectation then is that with income gains, we would see a greater effect on the fertility of those with less human capital, lower levels of education relative to those with higher levels of education. Coming back to that trade-off between time and money, economists also noted that for most Americans, most of our income comes from the participation in the labor market. And so, yes, the more time you spend in the labor market, the more money you'll make, but that means there's less time for other things, leisure, but particularly in this case, child rearing. And so particularly for the person assumed to do the majority of the child rearing and childcare work, and historically this was assumed to be women, there was a problem in the sense that you have a trade-off between your time costs and your gains from being in the labor market and income. And so the expectation is that labor-related income has this sort of less intuitive, less obvious solution for increasing fertility, whereas non-labor income, right, that not attached to the labor market, should have a stronger connection and likelihood of increasing fertility. And so we can draw from that as well and think that non-labor income should have a stronger effect on fertility than labor-related income. So this has been the theory for decades. And there's been a lot of work to try to assess and evaluate it, even using what have been called quasi-experimental or natural experimental designs. But the prior research and findings are inconsistent, regardless of whether you look at the results related to labor income or non-labor income. So when we look at studies that try to look at external changes to labor-related income, and really that's what I mean when I say exogenous, it's outside of the person's choice, outside of their sort of predispositions and their situation and surroundings. This is some external change that occurs to them. And so when we find these external changes related to labor market income, we see that some of the studies do find what new home economics theory would expect. There's other work that contradicts that. The studies, there's been a study that did the rise of EITC benefits, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which are benefits for low-income families, but they're tied to participation in the labor market. It didn't lead to increasing fertility. In fact, for a certain segment of the population, it led to declining fertility. So it's not always clear. Then again, the expectations for labor income are more muddled than non-labor income. So when we turn to the results for non-labor income, this should be more crystal clear, but even then the results sometimes vary. Recent work done with the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend. This is like a basic income program for permanent residents of Alaska that people get money on an annual basis for being a permanent resident, but the value varies across years because it's a reflection of a whole bunch of stuff, but it reflects the price of oil and gas for the last 3 years. So the benefits change. And what different studies have done is looked at, well, when benefits are higher, does it lead to more fertility? And a lot of evidence to suggest that from 2 different ongoing projects, separate projects, that it does increase fertility. However, when we look back in the historical record and think back to the role of our prior welfare program, AFDC, and whether it had no tie to the labor market, whether it increased fertility, on average, most studies found there was no effect, like 90-something%. One study did find a small effect for white women and a change in birth spacing for unmarried Black women, but on par, the general evidence was not aligned with the new home economics theoretical expectations. So it's into that empirical fray we jump. We also jump in with a critical eye theoretically. Many sociologists find the new home economics model unsatisfying for a variety of reasons. Where we come in is it's essentially an atomistic individual oriented theory, right? The only things that vary for fertility are based on individual and couple level factors. There is no social environment. There are not any roles of larger institutions. They are erased in this theoretical framework. And the arguments are kind of made as if these patterns and processes were universal and driven by simply individual rational choice actors. And that's where we jump in. Like others, we too have been frustrated. And so we work toward building a more contextual theory of fertility. So we tiptoe into critiquing Becker. And to do so, though, we build upon the theory of conjectural action, which is a wonderful book if you haven't read it. The authors are Jennifer Johnson Hanks, Chris Bachrach, Phil Morgan, and Hans Peter Kohler. And in this book, they argue that people's material conditions, right, the lived experience of their environment set by these large social and policy structural factors, as well as sort of the cultural values, schemas, norms that people have, circumscribe their behavior. And people can strategically deploy them, but these material resources and cultural schemas are not equally distributed. And so that allows here in a space for the contextual, for the community to emerge. And so our argument is that income could affect fertility in particular conditions. And we focus on a specific material condition and a particular schema that could condition that effect. Now, we don't try to do everything, that would be insane, but we do think of one example of material condition and one example of a schema. And so let's walk through that. You guys are quiet and I can't see you, so I'm hoping this is okay.
All going great, Molly.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so what material condition do we emphasize? Well, here we draw on great work by prior demographers who have noted the role of gender equity. So in particular, recall that trade-off between time and money as you spend more time in the labor market. Well, demographers have noted that that trade-off is minimized, particularly for women, in places where there is more equity in pay in the labor market. And while it's not always overtly stated, the idea or assumption is that if there's greater equity in the labor market, this equity might translate and transfer out into the larger community and particularly into households, wherein the trade-off of time and energy within households might also be more equitable, such that the burden of child rearing might be more equally distributed by members of different sexed households, right? And so the idea is that trade-off becomes weaker, and so fertility could be greater. Thus, we draw from that and think that the effective income could be greater, we hypothesize, in places where there is greater pay equity. Now, switching gears to thinking about schemas in the language of Johnson Hanks, our starting place is to build on research by Zelizer and Wary, who note that income is not simply instrumental, it's not simply financial, but it's also symbolic and very value laden. The very fact that we can have like a, we have money, we have money saving up for vacation or retirement fund. We label, we separate, we categorize his money, her money. All of that is a symbolic dimension, right? So money often, or income often, has a symbolic label. And we make note that income can be one of the values it can signal and indicate is it can be a measure of security. And in the language of cultural sociology, security is an evaluative value and a form of personal culture. But the cultural sociologists note you can't leverage your values unless they're relevant and applicable. And so to help make our argument, we got to bring in one more value. And while it's often trite to say family values, we actually need family values. And a particular one, as we've observed, our traditional American expectations for family and family formation often followed a really traditional sequence that is often mirrored in the board game Life. I'm not sure if you played it or if it's been a while, so let me just show you. You start off in life basically as a late adolescent. You either begin your career or you start going to college. And then, you keep rolling to keep moving forward. And the idea is you build your human capital, skills and experience. Great. And that then means you're eligible and you move forward in the board to the Whitechapel and you get married. That's the next step. And then you keep playing, moving forward, building human capital. And some refer to marriage as a relational capital, a relationship form of security. And that then leads you to be eligible to have children, which occurs around here in your board game. Okay. This is the traditional and quite common sequence of family events that we observed when the life course was more structured in the 1950s. But as family sociologists have noted, this traditional sequence is no longer really and truly an option for all, and is particularly divided along social class lines, such that lower women from working class families or poor families don't have, and the partners that they might want or meet don't have the same capacity or options and opportunities to build their human capital, to build up this security and resources. And as such, it's shifted the sequence and opportunities and options for family formation. What that means for us then is that this idea of income as security and the sort of moving along this traditional route is really only possible for those who have come from this more middle and upper class background, for whom this traditional sequence is actually still available and relevant. And so for us, we expect or imagine that the effect of income would be greater for those who are married, and they've already been, if you will, along this traditional path in some form, and for those that are highly educated. And using that highly educated marker as a symbol, both of their current sort of class status, but also likely their childhood and family background. So our aim is not simply to stop with new home economics, but to build and contribute. And with these two particular hypotheses, think about and argue that income and its effect on fertility would depend on the conditions of the community and the ability to enact these traditional family values. And so to the new home economics model, we add these more conditional hypotheses, focus first on gender equity in the labor market, and then thinking about income as security. But before I turn to thinking about how we leverage the Marcellus Shale, I just want to note that it's also possible with the shifts that we've observed, there may be no effect of income on fertility at all. As society has shifted with a rise of individualism and declines of familialism and pronatalism, it might be that people get more income and then have a wider choice set to decide what and how they will use that money for to fulfill their personal goals. For some, that might be having children, but for many others, it may not be. We can't interpret a null effect. I wouldn't want to, but I want to raise it as a possibility in a world that's, and it's an idea that's way different than would come from new home economics. Okay, so what do we do? So for you to understand what we do, I need to give you a little bit more about Marcellus Shale and how it worked and what happened. The first thing to know is that it's gigantic, both in size, as this indicates, but it's gigantic in its financial value. It's also gigantic in the sense of the transformation that occurred. So it is the second largest natural gas field in the world. The largest is in Russia. It's estimated to have $1 trillion worth of recoverable gas, meaning it could fuel the East Coast energy demands for heating for at least 3 winters, solely and only from this field. So it's very valuable, and its proximity to the East Coast is also like golden for oil and gas companies. But while geologists knew that this gas was there, it didn't have any economic value until very recently. And the reason was because the gas is stored in microscopic pockets thousands of feet below the ground, and traditional drilling simply could not recover enough gas to make it worthwhile. So what happened? 2 technological innovations or inventions. The first is they shifted to what's called horizontal drilling. So a traditional well would have just gone straight down and you would have had access to the gas just right here. But with horizontal drilling, you now have access to a greater length of the shale, and thus a space for which you can extract gas. The second is what's commonly referred to as fracking, but its technical name is hydraulic fracturing. What that is depicted with these little bubbles. It's probably small, but the idea is they inject a mixture of water, sand, and a proprietary set of chemicals into the rock that creates tiny fissures. And through those fissures, then the microscopic gas is released and thus goes back up the wellhead. Okay, so the first well was drilled in southwestern Pennsylvania in 2005, but the real boom occurred between 2008 and 2010. Since 2013, there's been a bust, so one could study the bust, but I'm still on the boom. All right, so why did this matter for people? How does it matter economically? holding aside everything else that changed, just for a moment, what changed economically? Well, the first thing that's important to note is that property owners that hold the mineral rights for their property can sign a lease to the oil and gas companies that allow them to drill and extract the gas from beneath their property. They get paid for signing the lease, but they also then get royalty payments for the duration of the life of the lease and the life of the well, which means that they get a proportion of the profit that's made from the gas that is from beneath their property. Since I'm from Texas, in my world, this is referred to as mailbox money. It comes to you on a routine basis, on the basis of sales of things that you don't know that happened. But more than this infusion of income, this non-labor income from leasing and royalty payments, this was very much a labor market shift. There was a growth in employment and earnings across different occupational categories and industries as communities and labor markets shifted to support the industry. Most of the men that worked on the rig were out-of-state workers because it's a very specialized process. However, there was a demand for construction. There's truck drivers expanded, even in service work, hotel, restaurants, cleaners, to support and provide services for the men working on the rigs as the rig and wellheads that they were creating, the rigs moved forward, right? So this was a huge infusion of employment and earnings. And I can actually show that to you a bit later. It'll show up in my own data. So the key, though, for this to be exogenous is this needs to be external to the people, right? And so how can we see that it's external? I need the boom that the people live through to be dependent on external factors. So here's a map of Pennsylvania and New York above us. And the boom depends, and how we use it depends on three factors. Well, the first is you have to actually live above the Marcellus Shale. The Marcellus Shale boundary here is this, anything gray is where the Marcellus Shale exists. So it's in central and northeastern Pennsylvania and the west, but it's not in Philly and right south of me here. So there's parts of Pennsylvania that have the shale and parts that don't. The other thing to note is that in 2005, geological experts and gas and oil industry experts recognized that the shale itself varied in its economic value for them. They determined that based on the characteristics of the rock, not the surface, nothing about who lived there, the governments, nothing about that, but simply about the rock. Factors like its thermal maturity, depthness, porosity, thickness, the types of gas that's in there. I've learned a lot about rocks. That there was a part, this darker shaded part, that they seen as more economically viable. They would get more gas and more profit from drilling here than drilling outside of it. And so we're referring to this darker area as the core. And it's still above the shale, but these are, we're just calling it the non-core for lack of creativity. And then the third factor is this very nice state border. Pennsylvania allows hydraulic fracturing. New York does not. So the value of living above the core is only, for it to be economic in its nature for us, should only matter if you're in Pennsylvania, and it shouldn't matter if you're in New York. So for us, we use location above the shale, and basically this particular geological formation and in the part of the geological formation you're in, to instrument for income, to be this sort of predictor of how much money is infused and inserted into this local area. For us, our unit of analysis, for most analyses, there's school districts. Those are you probably can't see them. There's little tiny boundaries in these light gray lines, and that's what our unit of analysis is. That helps us because counties are too few, and so we'd have power issues. And while we think school districts, while geographically smaller, are socially meaningful, maybe not fertility, but definitely for children, and therefore the majority of our other work. Okay. So I'm not going to give you equations, but I want to give you sort of heuristics about understanding our model. So first, as I indicated, we use an instrument for income. So I need to walk through exactly what that means. For those in the room who are more familiar with this kind of work, we use two-stage least squares models. Recall what we're interested in is in the causal effect of income on fertility. The problem, though, is that income is likely correlated with a series of unobserved variables that also affect and cause fertility. Okay? So what we need is what's called an instrument. We need a variable that's independent of those unobserved variables. For us, it's location above the core of the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania after shale development that we think is sort of our instrument. Simplified here with just percent core. An idea or aim is that it is affects the income, but is not correlated with the unobserved factors. Now, this absence of an arrow is a huge assumption, and one to which we explore, and I'm happy to discuss in Q&A. But that's the basic premise and the idea. In the first stage of this two-stage least square model, we test to make sure that location above the core in Pennsylvania after the is associated with income gains. And then we use that prediction that to think through and estimate then a potentially causal effect of income on fertility. Okay, so that's what we're doing analytically. The second piece of this is we do a difference in differences model, and it's really building off a pre-post design. So there was a shale boom, and there's before and there's after, and that's really what we use. And so our treatment in this experiment is being above the Pennsylvania core, and we can look at fertility before and fertility after with a little bit of a lag to allow for conception and gestation, right? The babies don't just come automatically. And so most of our analysis uses fertility from 2012 for the post period. And then we have a comparison group, the people who live in Pennsylvania above the non-core part of the Marcellus Shale, and we can look at their fertility before and after. And so the first idea is we can look at this trend. That's a difference. And we can look at this trend. That's another difference. And so the difference in differences is to compare those, right? How did the trend for fertility in the core look different than the non-core? And the hope or the expectation is that this is a good comparison group, that the people and communities in the Marcellus Shale, Pennsylvania areas that were in that state and that geological formation, but not above the non-core, are a good comparison. Okay, so that's enough of that. If you want to see the full equations, ask me in Q&A. All right, so most of our dependent variables are at the district level. We look at fertility rates for everyone and by groups defined by age, education, and marital status. And then we are able to use individual models to look at birth spacing. So for women who have had 2 or more births, we can see if their birth spacing after the shale was potentially longer or shorter. Did the money increase or decrease birth spacing? Our key independent variables are many and come from multiple sources. I'm also happy to talk about this in Q&A. Our key variable that we measure in terms of is income, right? And we get this from tax records. So for Pennsylvania and New York, we have average total income for the district. And then for Pennsylvania, we also have it for particular income sources that are likely going to change with shale, specifically earnings, royalties, and then potentially property sales. To measure gender equity and thus look at that stratified model, we use data from before shale development to see the relative pay for men women relative to men. And then we categorize districts about whether they were above or below the median. So if they were higher than average in terms of equity or lower. For some models, but not all, and for those carefully attuned to the two-stage least squares model, in those two-stage least square models, we don't use demographic controls in case the shale also shifted some of these factors as well. But we've run the models with and without these controls, but some models have these demographic controls. We also, in consideration for whether Marcellus changed other things about the community that could also change fertility, we try to account for this in multiple ways. We run some falsification checks and test whether location above the core is predictive of these. We also include them as controls. So things about changing in the social sort of the stress of living through a boom economy, potential changes to pollution, and changes in housing prices in particular. And then for the birth spacing models, we have individual control variables as well. So moving forward. The whole paper builds steam to get to this, and we're and then the actual results are kind of fast. So I want to start though by saying Pennsylvania Marcellus Shale districts are normal and they look like the rest of the United States and the rest of the world when we find that on average, places with higher income have higher fertility. And that's what we can see here. The total fertility rate using a basic regression model, we can see in controlling for demographic and shale factors that places with more money have higher fertility rates. It's especially true for those in the younger ages, lower education, and unmarried. And we see these just correlations. The correlations, though, are limited, as I've indicated, because they're confounded by a whole host of other things. So let's move forward to our estimates to try to be causal. First, though, we have to ensure that our instrument works. So as I indicated, we're using location above the shale, the core of the Marcellus Shale, as our instrument for income. And we want to know, does that really predict income? And here we can predict total, earnings, royalties, and property sales. The first thing is the big and helpful thing, and that is for our Pennsylvania districts above the shale, whether it was the light gray or the dark, we see that the higher proportion of land over the core, the greater there was in total income, earnings, and royalties. But here you can see that most of the income gains were from earnings, not royalties. What this translates into is such that for districts that were 100% of their land was above the core, this led to, on average, an increase of $1,980 per household, if that gives you a quantitative sense. To test to make sure that the income gains were widespread, we want to make sure that they were in both places with high and low gender equity. These results are frustrating for my research team because we see that the income gains were larger in places of low gender equity. And so this might limit our results later in the sense that we didn't see as much income growth in the places with greater equity. Lastly, like the falsification check does our instrument really work? We should hope with our design that the location above the core does not increase income in New York. And that is indeed what we find. Okay, so that looks great. That's good. So we use the estimates from this using all land and the shale and total income going forward. So does exogenous change in income increase fertility? Well, first let's look at all Marcellus districts. Here we have our different dependent variables organized by whether they're at the district level or the birth spacing. The circles are point estimates. The solid lines, this is probably small, my apologies. The solid lines show you the 90th percentile confidence intervals, and these little dots that go out show you the 95th percentile confidence intervals. We show both because, especially later when we stratify the analyses, we get closer to smaller, we have smaller ends. Here we have 318 districts. We see an increase in income, increased fertility, not for everybody, but for those with a high school diploma or less. If you use a p-value of 0.10, you also see that there's marginal support that increased fertility among those with some college and those that are married. When we turn our eyes to our stratified analyses, recall that we expected the fertility change to be in places with greater gender equity. This first graph is for those with low gender equity, very close to zero. But this doesn't trouble us. We're like, okay, this goes along with what we thought. These are the stratified results for those with higher gender equity. Now we're getting smaller still for your screens. So my apologies for squinting. But again, if you use the p-value of 0.10, and here in this group of districts, we have a total of 146. So with 146 districts, we see marginal support for the idea that basically that effect that we saw for everybody, where fertility seemed to increase for those with a high school diploma or less, were concentrated in places of greater equity. And we see with the 90th 90 percentile confidence interval, also an increase in marital fertility. So in summary of the findings, just to be clear, or with words instead of pictures, our instrumental variables looks to work very well. We don't see, as new home economics would predict, gains in fertility overall for everybody. Instead, they are particular for women, and the strongest associations are found for those with women with a high school diploma or less. So we see some suggestive evidence for those who are married and in places of greater gender equity. What I did not show you is that we also use predicted royalties and predicted earnings to get at the consideration about which matters more, hypothesis 3. We do see that predicted royalties has a larger association with fertility in all the positive directions. However, the estimates are less precise and they're less likely to be statistically significant than the results for predicted earnings. I also didn't show a volume of results that are testing those assumptions in our model, and that the Marcellus didn't change something else. And it looks to be, and I'm happy to do this in Q&A, it looks to be that these results are not reflective of shifts to possibly the social environment or pollution or housing costs or risks of selective migration. So in summary, our hope and aim was to add to longstanding new home economics theory with sociological ideas and build and create a more contextual theory for fertility models, thinking about the particular constraints in the environments and potentially the cultural schemas people use and the ability to act on those cultural schemas. What's interesting to me, and it's really struck me, is that we actually see in this study that the Marcellus boom increased fertility for people and communities that were very similar in their social and economic and family traits, the traits that were the modal options in the 1950s baby boom. To me, this gives me a new way of thinking about Becker and his writings and the new home economics theory. He wrote as if this was universal, not recognizing the contextual and meaningful boundaries of what he saw because they came from a particular moment in time and place. So lastly, if someone asked me, would you recommend the United States create a policy of giving money to people to help increase fertility? As a good sociologist, I would say it's going to depend. I think it's going to vary depending on the local conditions and expectations people have for using that money. So thank you very much for your attention. And I want to thank Elizabeth Anana, Art Friedman, and Joseph Baraski, because without them, this project would not be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you. That was fascinating.
And now I can see you.
Yes, now you can see
I was looking at a
all.
camera the whole time. I was like, was boring for me.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well.
No,
Let me get my notepad.
we were all gripped to the screen there. Yeah, no, that was fascinating. Really excellent. A lot of applause going around there.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's see if we have a little time to start a conversation. If anyone has any questions they want to ask Molly, I know she'd be delighted to engage. I'm seeing a hand. Jenna, yeah, take it away, Jenna.
Hi, Molly. Thank you for this. It's such an interesting case of new income in hands and thinking about what that means. I'm curious, you didn't talk a ton today about unintended fertility.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you just tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about that fitting in here.
That's a great question and great issue. So for us, as we think about this, we've had basically a theoretical conversation, but are very limited empirically, right? We only have birth certificates and there's no information on there about plans or orientations. Yet we know from work, with music and Rayleigh and others that we often see class based differences in rates of unintended childbearing. Where we ended up circling around and theorizing was thinking more about what does the income mean and then how do people utilize it. So the expectation that undergirds much of, like when you keep pushing, a lot of the expectation that is undergirding the new home economics model is a very intentional model of behavior, right? That you have money, you make a choice, you have almost a ledger in front of you and you're thinking about more kids or fewer kids, but better educated kids or something to that degree. And so in many ways, the theory we start with, and I think this is one of the frustrations sociologists often have with new home economics, is that it's really a theory about intended fertility, right? And there's not a space for unintended. And so what's interesting is thinking through, and by diving into the cultural sociology literature, we began to grapple with issues of expectations, norms, and values, and that these are constraints, but not entirely deterministic factors. And so while I don't have a great answer for you, what we started to circle around is theoretically, what could income do for unintended fertility? Or let me back up and say one thing that could possibly happen is there could be births that we don't also, there's also importantly, there could be births that we don't, or pregnancies we don't see, right? There could be, and the question is whether there are unobserved factors by people's either initial status or the receipt of the income that then could potentially lead you to fully realizing the baby, whether it's adoption or fetal loss with someone. Okay, going back to the intentionality and whether you use fertility, use money for fertility. I personally think the theory as it exists and the theories that we explored it don't sufficiently probably work toward how could we theorize money and unintended fertility. And I think that's one to just own up to it. I think that's one space where we could work further and push again through the cultural sociology on thinking about, well, where and how does it show up? So yeah, this is right now really theoretically a model of intended. But as I've started diving into the cultural, I start to see the gaps and limitations, because then you move from a space of plan to unintended. I know this is unsatisfying, but I can't do anything with data. So this has all become a conversation in our heads. This is a conversation where we're sitting around the table. What would we think would happen? Would people, let me back up and say, if unintended means, say, so for some, in some scholarship, there's conversations around access to birth control, right? Or consistent use of birth control. And so we did have conversations with ourselves, well, okay, to what degree does access to income potentially change access to healthcare providers that could provide you with greater and more reliable, birth control? We don't see so far with other data evidence of shifts in health. Like, it's not like doctors rushed into the area with Marcellus Shale. Like, we tried to look, okay, so could the environment have changed with healthcare providers? And so far what we see, it doesn't look like it. It's not like I don't think most people knew this, like physicians knew this was going on. And so we don't see a shift in general practice healthcare. So we can't really see that there was potentially a greater option or opportunity. And when we do the paper on maternal health behaviors, we don't see an increase in adequate prenatal care usage. If you extrapolate back and think, well, would they go to prenatal care? Would those same people have gone to get, like, say, preconception care? If I extrapolate, and that's a big assumption, we don't see evidence of people doing that. So we're trying to walk through how the pathways could have worked. We don't think it would have worked through differential access to reliable birth control.
Thank you for that question, Jenna, and for your answer, Molly. There's a couple other hands have gone up. See Samer first, and then Noah, and then Catherine.
Welcome,
We're
Molly.
stimulating lots of people here.
Welcome, Molly, to Ag Hall, virtual Ag Hall.
Thank you.
So I have a very particular question. Did you your data comes from 2007 and then from 2011, and in between the Great Recession?
Yeah.
Did that have any effect on Pennsylvania and the structure of the economy, of life? And did you take that into account in the process of making the modeling, right? And in the data that you, because I can imagine that it actually might have a great effect on what you find and what you could argue.
Great question. Thank you very much. So yes, this is, Great Recession starts in 2007 and really picks up steam 2008. And we don't see sort of the rebound from it in Pennsylvania until, if I were thinking back to our employment, for the whole state, it starts around 2012 and 2013 in employment. And so, yes, this is, the economists, for them, this is great. Like if I had economists in the room, they'd be like, yes. Why? Because this is counter-cyclical, right? So in other words, the rest of the economy is tanking when I have a place in space where I can see gains in employment and income. So so from a modeling perspective, it's lovely that this is countercyclical because I can identify, it gives me more confidence that this is about the Marcellus and not about a general improvement in the economy. As we get to, if I were to model, say, later years of fertility, if I think, well, maybe it takes even long. So we did run models with 11, 12, and 13, and all the results I showed you here are for 12, thinking that the effects, people's intended ideas would have changed in 11. Conceptions and so forth would have only shown up as babies in 12. So the idea, though, is that, yes, this is fantastic. In terms of, and we can see with other data sources that, yeah, there were declines in employment, earnings, and so forth in other parts of the state that weren't above this core of the Marcellus. In terms of thinking about it for analysis and modeling, I just want to note that, and it kind of goes back to Jenna's question, when we were in the field and talking to people, the primary expectation for them to use the money was to pay down debts. And so, and I think that in many ways shows the role of the recession and the role of the sort of, in many ways, longer term hardships in many of these communities. And so for many of them, their first aim was the reduction of debt and potentially the social and psychological relief that would create. So that's where I think the recession came in. When we asked people about the recession, most people said, yeah, I've been hard up, but they didn't particularly identify it with the recession when we talked to them. They were in, but it also made them more excited about the jobs are coming. The jobs are coming. We will do better with the Marcellus.
Thank you, Samar, for the question. Thank you for your answer, Molly. Noah, you're up next. I guess also, folks, I think just want to say that, Molly is going to stay on a little bit longer here. We'll probably run things till 1:15 or so. But if people need to drop off and get to other things, completely understand. But Molly is available to chat a little longer for sure.
Great, Catherine. Can you stay those extra minutes because I don't want to preempt your question if you can't stay. Okay, good, great. So Molly, that was a wonderful talk. I have so many thoughts and so many questions, but I want to dig into one issue in particular, which has to do with your theoretical foundations. And it was inspired in some respects by your comment about Becker and universality and specificity. And I was thinking a lot about how this is not just any place. This is a very particular place. And so sort of the bigger issue for me is like thinking about schema, the schema part of the material and schema pair, like how does that play into your analysis in terms of thinking about how particular schema operate in this particular context? Because it seems like that should inform your theories in some ways. More broadly, I think I'm interested in whether this theoretical foundation offers you any insight into what sorts of material and schematic factors might be, like in essence, limiting resources for fertility under particular circumstances. So like whether conjectural action tells you that, under these conditions, we would expect material circumstances to be limiting, whereas under these conditions, we would expect schematic factors to be limiting. So big mouthful of a question. I'd love to hear what you think.
Thank you. Yeah, so what so my apologies if this is incongruent with other people's ideas. One thing I appreciate about the theory of conjectural action is that it really, to me, it's less a theory and more a perspective, and like life course perspective, right? It draws our attention to paying attention to material conditions and schema, but it doesn't tell you it needs to be A, B, and C, and they should work through these routes and these mechanisms, and then go test them. And so they highlight the emphasis of material conditions and schema, but they don't tell you which, when, where, and why. So to me, it feels more like a perspective than a theory, but I'm not going to argue with their title. They're very good scholars. They can do what they want. But in terms of my particular case, so you're right in that what I did draw upon was, as a start, what might be seen as more universal like predictors. So gender equity has been discussed in multiple forums in gender scholarship of work and fertility and family. And so we went there first, in part because there was empirical evidence to think that this might be a key point. But you're right in the sense that it has nothing to do with Pennsylvania in 2010. In a particular way. And similarly, we drew from more, say, broadly discussed ideas about what should family formation look like and how should it occur, how has it occurred, for whom is it possible, and when is it not possible. So again, in some sense, this is again drawing from broad literature that's not particular to Pennsylvania in 2010 and so on. So I take your I maybe it's not meant as a critique, but I take your point quite clearly in working to start somewhere. We started from somewhere we thought we had empirical background to move forward. However, it isn't sufficient, I would argue, and it isn't reflective of Pennsylvania 2010. I think that if I were to say, keep going with this and this line of thought, and if I had the data, so that was the other side. We're consistently limited by what's available in a birth certificate and the American Community Survey. But if we're that not a limit, if I were able to just dream and dream big, I think I would particularly wish to have information from family members, both senior elders of the family and young adults, asking about where they want to be. So a constant refrain when we were in the communities and collecting our interview data and our and survey data was that parents, so that was, at the time we were thinking we were trying to write a big NIH grant to study adolescents and so on. And so we had parents of those kids. So I don't have exactly my group of people. Like I don't have young adults about to have babies. These people had babies when I was talking to them. But what common thing in refrain, and they had a wide age range of children, is they were hopeful that the Marcellus Shale would allow their children to stay in the community. This could keep them there, right? But I'm not so sure what younger people or younger adults would want, and what younger adults saw as their potential opportunities, and what they saw then as their life course goals. And do they want to stay? Many of them do. So a lot of people reflect ideas that I've read about in rural sociology, thinking about like attachment to place. You see this strong attachment to place. So maybe the young adults would also say, I want to stay here. But I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure in this environment and these communities if they would. And so if I were thinking about Pennsylvania 2010 cultural schemas, I think I would want more data about attachment to place and then what they think then family life means, because it has this multi-generational family farm, staying here, staying close to the land dimension that I can't get in any ACS data. But I think those would be the kinds of schema I'd want to know more about, and thinking about then what does constrain or give us opportunity for being there. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's the kind of thing I'd rather have.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Noah and Molly, for your response. Catherine.
Hi, Molly. It's good to see you. Really enjoyed your talk, and I'm really also enjoying this conversation. Your talk, one of the things I very much appreciate is the acknowledgement of that heterogeneity or of the context specific, and also the ability to see to whom this applies. So I think that's a real strength here. I think that some of my questions actually feed off of what Noah was asking a bit about, and maybe I'll be more critical. But I want to talk with you more about your selection of location. This is not going to be a surprise to you. Your selection of location as an instrument. Yeah. And part I think about it with regard to spatial dimensions and the context that your study is in, and thinking about the location of that core, especially with regard to not only state boundaries, but also, as you were saying, Philly's over here, like where are we talking about? Yeah. And so what that location meant in relationship to those U's, and then also coming from the spatial domain and not necessarily the fertility domain, but understanding that fertility is one of the examples of the spatial diffusion model, which I think relates to the cultural piece of your discussion today. So I just wanted to push a little bit more on the idea of location as an instrument, and how confident you are in the security of that assumption, and how you would respond to someone who's less confident. And it may also get back to the question of, well, if you had any other data, what would the better instrument be?
So thank you. So the first thing to note is that we also looked into doing more than what I should say here. And so two more things we did. One, we really wanted to think about diffusion and diffusion of development, particularly of Marcellus. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but in Pennsylvania, there are two hubs. They're shut down. Basically, two hubs of development, one right south of Pittsburgh and one in Williamsport. And these were the central locations. And this is where gas and oil industries set up locations. I went to one of them. It looked like the Death Star landed in this little weird town south of Pittsburgh. It was like these like massive black 5-story office parks. Like it was just like, here we come. And it was crazy. And so, and they infused with workers, lawyer, like, and and they're lobbyists, and they came to these 2 towns. And we're like, okay, this is Williamsport's closer to me. And so I knew better, like I didn't have to go as far. I could see what's going on in Williamsport and could talk to people from Williamsport. And yes, there was this like flood of people. Even someone in my neighborhood was actually a worker in Williamsport. Anyways, some lawyer. The point is, those are the 2 hubs. And so we thought, okay, this is the location, and whether it's sending out workers, sending out equipment, sending out the MS, I'm blinking on the name, what do they call them? The guys that sign the leases, the sending them out into the communities, they could have come from these 2 places. So we tried to look to see if we could find like the equivalent of ripples, right? So proximity to the hub, and does it change over time in terms of development? So we have this intersection of time and space. No, sadly, it doesn't work that way. In other words, everything by those 2 hubs is always on fire, if you will, for development. And it doesn't leave. Like, in other words, there's no ripple. The net gets wider, but it doesn't depart from the places they already developed. They keep just building up. And so we couldn't use that, the intersection of time and place. We also do use in some models and in work, I didn't show today, but can. There's another important source of exogenous variation, and that is the presence of coal. So coal's in the Southwest, not in the Central and the Northeast. In the coal boom of the 1900s, companies bought people's mineral rights. And so in the Southwest, you can have the labor boom, but no royalties. And in the North, Central, and East, you get both. And so we try, but now I'm splicing a 300 into another way. You're getting a power problem. So that's on the table. But and so the goal was to see labor and non-labor and whether or not and how it works. It doesn't buy me anything, but it was fun to figure out. So I have all these maps that I geocoded, and it didn't matter. But we kept thinking about other ways, and we kept thinking about other challenges of space. You're right to note that we haven't yet run the most sophisticated like GIA models or GIS models that have sort of the correlated spatial errors. Stephen Matthews has been on me about it. I agree. But I don't have to be honest, I don't have the knowledge and personnel that are appropriate to help me do that correctly. So that's a place where we could grow, Catherine.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Catherine, for that exchange. That was fascinating. Christine, I see your hand is up.
Hey, Molly, thanks so much for that really interesting talk. I have a lot of questions as well, but I'll just pick one, which is, can you tell us about what migration looked like to these specific areas over this period of time?
Yes, I can. So there's 2 answers to that question. 2 answers to the question. The first is thinking about the transitory laborers. So the rig workers, they're typically from Texas and Oklahoma, and they come to work the rig, and they move as the rig moves. And so this, they set up shop and they set up in these communities. And I visited one. There's these giant industrial sites that come out of nowhere, put the rig up. It's there for several weeks, and then they move when they go to drill somewhere else. Most of the time, they don't move their families with them because they work shifts that are the typical oil and gas work schedule is 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, working 12-hour days. It's another when we talk to oil and gas industry experts, they're like, Pennsylvanians are too weak to work this. They don't want to work for us. And so, well, I don't think I know many people that want to work 2 weeks on for 12 hours every day. But hey, weakness, I don't know, labor rights maybe. But so most of the rig workers, because they have this schedule and then they get 2 weeks off, their family stayed back home. So in terms of this transitory workforce, most of them didn't come with family members. At the time, though, when we were in the field, a lot of people, though, feared these out-of-towners coming. They're like, oh, we're going to have to, even there was conversation that was like, the schools, we have to integrate all these children of these workers, and we're going to have to teach Spanish, and and there was this fear of the outsider that was consistent and refrained. And in the end, those shifts didn't occur. because I think most workers did not bring their families. Okay, so that's the first story. The other story comes back, actually, I think it was something I mentioned to Noah's question about the attachment to place. Many people might think that you would get the money and run, right? You're gonna, okay, sell your property, it's poison, and run to, say, Florida and go live out your life and not in the freezing cold gravel road, bad, like hard to get into the depths of winter around. But in fact, when we were talking about, no one intended to leave. No one intended to leave. They had a strong attachment to place, and they did not expect to go. So that was what we thought. The risks of moving in, property values did change after leasing arrangements began to be signed, and some properties went for exorbitant amount of money. But we don't see evidence with the tax data that property sales changed or that property sales increased in the areas of the core. So it doesn't look like there was this big property sell-off. And it's also the case that people, Pennsylvania is slow in assessing, I learned this from Diane McLaughlin, Pennsylvania is slow to assess property value. So it also wasn't the case that it's almost every decade. And so it wasn't the case that people were from the legal assessors getting evaluated for greater property. So the incentive to sell and leave was lower. Okay, so that's all that. Demographically, when I look in the ACS data, I don't see evidence of a shift in migration. So let me go back. So I wanted to start with the qualitative of what I knew, and then I can get to the quantitative of what I know. Back to the PowerPoint. Okay. All right. If I go now, this I might have to shift to the other screen. Let's see.
And just for
Okay.
folks who are trying to balance other obligations and things, probably after this exchange, we'll wrap things up. Okay,
so using ACS data, this is essentially like a pre-post. This is a lot like the stage one. So in other words, what we're using here, these are each one is a separate, every cell, every paired estimate and standard error is a separate regression. And basically what I'm doing is looking at whether the proportion of the district's land above the core of the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania Marcellus districts, did it predict a change in the proportion of the population of, say, traditional fertility ages? Did it change the proportion of the population aged 25 or older who are female? Did it change the proportion of women who are married? These are more counts. Did it change the the number of women in that age range, the number of married women age 15 and older, and the number of never married women? When there are little stars or signs, it's on this side. So there might have been a loss of never married women aged 15 and older in all districts. And in low places with, so this is a low gender gap, I should relabel this as greater equity. In the greater equity districts, there might have been a loss of the number of married women, or there's a loss of number of married women and number of married women. But in terms of the proportion in the population composition, I don't see evidence of that. So I don't think there was selective migration in or out, because the composition in proportionate terms by who could possibly be there for having children didn't change. Does that answer?
Yeah, thanks.
Now I can see you. Okay, sorry. I had to go back to and you.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you, Ken. I have lots, as you saw, other slides that we can.
Yeah, I was
do
going to
later.
say, it was very plain. There's a lot of cool other data in the back end of this talk. I got a bunch of questions too, but I'll have another chance to chat with you, so we can talk about it then. But I think we should let you go at this point, and with thanks for a really stimulating presentation, truly. So let's maybe give Molly another round of applause.
Thank you.
And if you want to follow up more with Molly, she does still have some openings on her schedule for this afternoon and tomorrow. So send a note to Megan Benesack, and she'll get you slotted in.
I look forward to the opportunity.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks, everyone.
See you tomorrow, Molly.
Oh, great. Thank you.